And so glad to host this event with the three editors of Teaching in the Anthropocene. And going to introduce them in just a moment. I think Dilrab is going to introduce them. But just to get it started, my name is Carrie Karsgaard, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here, funded by SSHRC, but working at Arizona State University's Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, who is hosting this event along with the Education for Sustainability and Global Futures Learning Futures Collaborative, also in collaboration with the Regional Center for Expertise on Education for Sustainable Development here in Phoenix. And some of the folks who head up all of these groups are here in the audience today and glad to be joining us. And as I mentioned to the authors, this book, it will be available to everyone in the Learning Futures Collaborative. So this is your sneak peek if you haven't read it already. I know a few people here already have. So I think we'll have a good dialogue today with the editors. And so I'm going to pass it off to Dilraba to introduce herself and the authors, and then they'll give a brief introduction to their book, and we'll have some dialogue after that. Dilraba.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dilraba. I'm a second-year PhD student here at ASU, Educational Policy and Evaluation, and I'm really excited to meet you because I'm really interested in intersection of environmental education and rural education. You can see here three editors. Alysha Farrell is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at Brandon University. Her research focuses on the emotional dimensions of teaching and learning in the face of climate crisis. She uses arts-based methods like playwriting, forum theater, and narrative photography to share stories about what it means to live and learn in a warming world. Dr. Candy Jones is a currently associate professor and chair of Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy in the Faculty of Education at Brandon University. Her research interests include rural education and capacity building, rural identity, teacher professional development, particularly in rural context, math education, self-study, and teacher education identity. Prior to entering the Faculty of Education at BU in 2015, Professor Jones spent 20 years as a secondary educator in 3 different rural Manitoba communities. She's both passionate about strength and beauty of rural spaces and advocate for those who live and work within them. Michelle Lamb. Professor Lamb is a director of Brandon University Center for Aboriginal and Rural Education Studies. She is a co-host of Learning In and Speaking Out podcast. She developed a board game called Refugee Journeys and produces a series of educational films on anti-racism. An educator and activist for over 20 years, Dr. Lamb speaks and writes in innovative ways to create positive change. She is interested in rural immigrants and potential of education and relationship building for equity. Welcome all. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Dilraba, for that introduction. We're really honored to be with all of you today. For those of you who are working in the field of climate justice and eco-justice and climate change education, sometimes you can feel like a lonely voice. And so these moments to get together, and it sounds like you have this beautiful cohort of people that gather together to talk about these very important issues. I think that's amazing and wonderful. And so we're so happy to be here. Before we talk a little bit about the book, I wanted to tell you that Brandon University campuses, where Candy and Michelle and I are zooming to you from, they're located on Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 lands here. And those are the traditional homelands of the Dakota, the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, the Dene, and the Métis people. And we are incredibly grateful for the hospitality of the Indigenous peoples who have cared for this land for many, many generations. And we are grateful to all of the other beings in the more than human world that make this an event like this possible. We thought we'd spend a few minutes with you this morning talking a little bit about why we got involved in this book project, and then just highlight a couple of ideas from the book, and then get to the, I think, most exciting part, which is engaging in conversation around some of these topics. So when I think about my why for getting involved in this book project, Teaching in the Anthropocene, I think it's because I'm a radically hopeful person, even though I spend my days thinking about the climate crisis as it relates to education. Because I believe that if we were to face it head on in the field of teacher education programs, we could potentially educate for a different world. And we could make some different judgments about what and how we teach and center those judgments on the flourishing of life, as opposed to some of the other ways we're currently making judgments that are more about, I think, the interests of late stage capitalism and capitalists. The book was also a chance to make room for the messy emotions that come with teaching and learning in precarious times, and a way to keep my promise, to write myself into the ethical obligations of what it means to be a teacher in the Anthropocene. And so it's making me keep my promises to keep talking and writing about these ideas, because I think about my own kids, the students I currently teach, and I also think a lot about the graduating class of 2050. Michelle.
Thanks, Alysha. So for me, when my colleagues asked me if I'd like to join them in co-editing this book, it wasn't just because I jumped at the chance to work with these wonderful colleagues, which is true, but it's also because it was the beginning of weaving together some very poignant threads in my own life and in my own work. So I was an EAL, which is English as an Additional Language. I was an EAL teacher for about 15 years before transitioning into this world of academia. And so I was teaching immigrants and refugees who were settling in Canada, mostly adults. And the stories that they were telling me over these years really challenged the truths that I thought that I knew. This idea that all Canadians are warm and friendly and welcoming, we're such good people. I really had these kind of rosy glasses on about who my country was, about who I was. And then I started hearing their stories about how they were being treated at the supermarket, or while they were looking for housing, or just on the street. The things that they were experiencing did not line up with my self-concept of myself or my country. And it was time for those rosy glasses to come off. And so when I think about the climate crisis, and just reading recently, by the year 2050, we're supposed to see 1 out of every 50 people on the planet displaced because of the climate, like 1 in 50. And when I think about stuff like that, it chills me to my bones, because currently Canada is doing, I would say, mediocre at best, doing a mediocre at best job of making people feel welcomed or feel like they belong. We have so far to go, and we're facing this huge wave of an influx coming. And so we're simultaneously contributing to these movements while clapping ourselves on the back for being such good humanitarians. And so when I think about these projections and I hold those students' stories that I've heard over the years, I feel this deep sense of urgency. And at the same time, when I'm writing or thinking about these kinds of topics, usually somewhere in the back of my head, I can hear my dad's voice. My dad is a rural person, grew up in a small town, still lives in a small town. He's a very deep thinker. He reads a lot. He's very intelligent, and he doesn't believe in climate change at all. And so we have very interesting conversations about this. The other day, he was talking about what it meant to grow up in the Cold War era, and feeling like all of this fear that he grew up with in his formative years didn't turn out, like no nukes ended up coming to his backyard after all. And he feels the same way about all of this stuff that he reads about the climate change. He says things like, it probably will turn out to be nothing, same as it did last time, right? And so 2 things coming out of that conversation for me were that, 1, people have reasons for believing what they believe, or thinking how they think, or behaving how they behave. But 2, I need to be able to hold the stories like my dad's story together with the stories like my students' stories. And my role in holding all of those pieces together is sort of to think about, how can I become an agent of unsettling some of those truths that once were thought to be true? How could I invite my dad to see differently? Or how is it that I came to see differently about my own country? And I think it's through those stories. So that's how I come to this work. It's with this deep belief that hearing the stories of others is incredibly powerful, and that these shifts can become powerful in helping build bigger stories about how our country or our planet can become a place where everyone can belong and can feel like they belong there. So that's how I'm coming to this work. And I'll turn it over to you, Candy.
Hi, I'm Candy, and as indicated in the brief descriptions at the beginning, my background ties me to rural places and values. Much of my research is focused on education within rural contexts, and the climate crisis is important to me for many of the same reasons that Alysha and Michelle have already spoken about. But the reality for rural communities is that they're disproportionately affected by climate change. Economic activities in rural communities like agriculture and forestry and tourism, those are all at risk of being devastated by climate-related disasters, in addition to the social structures that depend on those economic activities. At the same time, the economies of scale in rural communities impact their ability to respond to the kind of inevitable emergencies that they face and will continue to face over the coming years. For example, like small communities have limited resources in dealing with wildfires or floods, for example, but it's known all too well that that's going to be increasing over time. And so I live in and work in contexts where these realities are sort of juxtaposed against I would say profound connections to land, agriculture, wildlife, community, those sorts of things that exist in rural spaces. So those things that add value to the lives of rural people and offer promise for our youth and for our future, these are juxtaposed against the realities of impending climate crisis. So I see climate change and anthropocentrism as threats to rural ways of knowing and being, which is why the project really resonated with me. I'll just say a bit about the book. The project sought to connect a variety of researchers, educators, academics across Canada. It was pan-Canadian in scope. We purposefully kind of included chapters from diverse geographic places across Canada. So we paid attention to where the authors were located so that there were diverse points of view, diverse landforms, etc., kind of represented within the pages of the book. The authors were from various stages of their careers and had diverse cultural backgrounds. We were particularly hopeful that we would include Indigenous perspectives and cosmologies in the book. Diversity, place, and context had to matter to us when we were addressing a topic like climate change, as did promoting and exploring sort of land-based, place-based pedagogies and what they have to offer the world and our students more specifically. We wanted to include concrete examples of curriculum pedagogies in practice, things that were being used and had the potential to help us all deal with the predicament that we're in our contexts. And the result is a book that explores theoretically the predicament we're in as human beings and educators, and also offers pedagogies that inspire hope and possibility in the face of global challenges. Another thing that we focused on including in the projects were arts-based approaches, something I think Michelle will share a bit more about.
Sure. Thanks, Candy. So when we were talking about how to write the postscript in the book, I just finished a workshop with a Cree elder, and she was sharing the belief that children hold knowledge that sometimes we as adults have already forgotten. And centering children's voices became a key part of the book. You can see the cover as it was the cover, and throughout the book, you can see children's artwork where we collaborated with a local school. Thanks, Robin. So you can see like those children used a variety of mediums to create art in response to different prompts. But in addition to their art, there's also a strong focus on arts-based methods throughout the chapters. So if you've been reading the book, you'll probably pick up on that thread. We also had Grace Stone, who was a research assistant. She helped us immensely in putting the book together, but she's also an amazing artist in her own right. And so she created this image that you can see at the beginning of each section. And then there's this thread running throughout the chapters. You can see narrative photography, poetic inquiry. We see student created artwork in different forms. There's digital art, other forms. And so this does become a really strong thread. And this was because we really believe that arts-based methods and art in general is a powerful tool for learning and self-discovery and personal growth, but it's also really powerful for communicating and for evoking things out of us that we might not get in the same way if we were just reading text. And so this ability to engage us on this emotional level when we create or we experience art, we can tap into those feelings and connect in a different way, in a really meaningful way. And we wanted to have our book focus on that in a central way. So it became a strong thread. And Alysha's chapter also, if you've read, is it includes a lot of narrative photography. And so she is very experienced in this. And I'll turn it over to you, Alysha, to talk about the emotions as well.
Yeah. One of the things that the three of us hold dear is that this belief that if getting people the right information or even scarier information to get them to react was the answer, we would already be a lot further ahead thinking about reacting to the climate crisis in the context of education. So we know that's not the case. So year after year, climate scientists sort of present us with dire facts about the world that we're currently experiencing, and then what's their projections on what's to come. So if it isn't a matter of just giving people more information, more dire information or information in more clever ways, then what is it? What is causing sort of the widespread disavowal of the climate crisis in the field of education for the most part? And that's the curiosity that drives my research agenda. And so I'm really curious about, and you can see this in my chapter, what are the emotional dimensions of what it means to be a teacher as the Earth's habitability decreases? And so I am very curious about how people turn away from difficult knowledge, how educators are able to hold difficult emotions in their classrooms. And you all know that the climate crisis is an emotionally charged topic. It's a highly politicized topic in some provinces in Canada and certainly some states in the United States, thinking about our friends to the south. And so how do we hold the difficult knowledge of petroculture and the climate crisis whilst we try to work together and make space for radical hope? And I think thinking about the emotional dimensions, making space for the language of eco-anxiety and eco-grief in the field of public education might crack open more of a space for that radical hope to emerge. Because one thing that I've learned, I just took a climate psychology certificate program out of CIIS in the fall, and we spent 70 hours working around that topic of climate emotions under the umbrella of climate psychology. And one of the things that our very talented and wise presenters talked about over and over again is if you push the feelings down, that's never a good thing. And so we need to open spaces in classrooms to talk about the climate crisis. But I think what educators have told me in my research and the things that I'm reading is they require more support in doing so. More curriculum that takes this up, more professional development supports that takes it up, so they feel more comfortable facilitating these types of conversations and creating activities across disciplines that will give kids an opportunity to make sense of their worries and fears about their future. So that's a little bit about why the emotional dimensions of climate change were so important in the context of teaching in the Anthropocene. But I'd like to turn it over now to our wonderful host, Carrie, I think, who's going to help us engage in some conversation together about some of these topics.
Thank you for that lovely introduction to the book. And I think the audience here will have a lot of questions because there's folks here who are doing research with teachers, people who are doing research in with arts and the Anthropocene. And I think an interesting dialogue may need to be had among some of the rural locations represented here. Not everyone here is from Phoenix. There's people here from some rural communities in Canada as well who might relate to your context, but also, thinking in dialogue between some of those rural spaces and these urban places that are on the frontier of the Anthropocene as well, where we live in a mega city with no water here in Phoenix. And so thinking through, how do we face that in context of climate denial as well, and some of the politicization of education here in Arizona. So lots of questions. All to say, audience, I invite you to put questions in the chat anytime, or also to raise your hand if you'd like to ask one out loud. In the meantime, Dilraba and I will get the dialogue going a little bit. I have lots of questions, but to start off, being a fellow scholar from so-called Canada, I found, the volume through its selection of contributors and topics really address Anthropocene in relation to Canada's context as a settler colonial state. And, you open with the land acknowledgement and mentioned your purposeful inclusion of Indigenous authors. And so I think this is really important, both within Canada, but in related contexts like here in the US. And so can you talk a little bit about how you understand the Anthropocene in relation to settler colonialism and the role of education in that space? Potentially in relation to place-based education, which you've mentioned already a little bit.
Michelle and Kenny, is it okay if I give it a spin here and then you can jump in? Okay. I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Melissa Nelson during the climate psychology course. So a knowledge keeper, a stellar academic, and activist. And she talked about this idea of the fact that colonial countries like Canada have, she used the phrase, "we have forgotten our original instructions." That's one way that she described it. And so she talked poetically about how there's been, with Western style colonial education, we've distanced ourselves from the heartbeats and howls of our ancestors and the more than human world. And so it was very important to us to think about those teachings that we have been gifted in relation to talking about education. And so one of the ways that we've been thinking about that is this idea of how do we incorporate something referred to as two-eyed seeing. And the scholar's name and the elder is going to come to my name. Candy, do you remember the scholar and elder?
Marshall.
Yeah, Elder Marshall. And so the way he's described it is this concept of two-eyed seeing. So it's learning to see with the one eye using Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledges, and learning to see with a Western eye, with Western ways of knowing and knowledge. And he said the key to this, to figuring out the difficulty around the climate crisis, is learning to see education with two-eyed seeing. And if we can get closer to that, we'll make a difference here. And so the intentionality around thinking about Indigenous cosmologies and ways of knowing and being in the world in the book is an attempt to get closer to two-eyed seeing in the field of education. I don't know if Candy or Michelle, you wanted to add anything to that.
I can add something around the settlement field for immigrants and refugees. We've been having really interesting conversations in those spaces around who exactly is doing the welcoming. And so we have old settlers welcoming new settlers to land that is co-opted or has been consigned in certain ways. And an Indigenous elder locally sat across the table from me during one of these meetings and said, we have ways of welcoming culturally that include feasts and include ceremonies. And why are we not doing these feasts and ceremonies? It's because we haven't been invited to these spaces. And I won't forget that, I don't think, for a long time, that when we think about land and the capacity, and we think about all of these things in relation to the climate crisis, we need to think about whose voices are being centered in that conversation. And as we, Canada sets targets every year for immigration numbers and how many refugees are we going to settle and where are they going to settle, those voices will become more and more important, I think. And it's looking backwards, it's, I think, shameful that they haven't been included in those conversations very, very much. So that's, I think, from the settlement perspective where I would say. Candy, did you want to say anything?
I would just add, Indigenous ways of knowing have been around for a long time. And if you think about Indigenous roles like water protectors, for example, there's a long line of Indigenous understandings about the environment and nature and its relation to human beings in the more than human world that I think people are starting to understand more the value of. I talked quite a bit in my chapter about like the way we value sort of rural ways of knowing. I think the same is true in terms of Indigenous ways of knowing, that settler mentality, in many cases, settlers don't even know what they don't know in terms of Indigenous understandings of the environment and the land. And I think many of the answers that we seek exist within those bodies of knowledge.
Maybe continuing talking about centering rurality and rural knowledge. I really enjoyed reading about chapters on rural education. And there was a rhetorical question. I think, Dr. Jones, you wrote, if the brightest and youngest rural minds educated out of rural places, who is left to envision the future of rural communities? And really, it really resonated with me because I'm from rural Kazakhstan and I left. So I started like thinking on, so if rural youth is living, what is left and how can we kind of like resist all this maybe capitalistic workforce, all this like basically trying to leave like ways of living. So also you gave some pedagogical solutions in class. So can you talk about like those in class solutions, but also like out of in community? How can rural communities survive basically, right? And nurture themselves?
Thanks for the question. And I will note too that Alysha is also from a rural context as a young person, and so is Michelle, so they can add in as well. I think that one of the things, when Karin Kafala's book came out about rural brain drain in the central United States, I was profoundly impacted by that hollowing out the middle book that they wrote. I think it's 2009. And I've been thinking about rural brain drain ever since. And I think about it in relation to the communities that I've been a part of and about my own rural upbringing as well. I was, like probably many of you, educated out of a rural community. I'm particularly interested in the ways that we tell our youngest and brightest students in rural places that like university is something that they need to attend, which means they need to leave the community. So they're coached from a very young age to leave. And the sad part of that is they know the place and the land the best. They're the people that have the potential to provide local solutions to issues that are faced in rural communities. And climate crisis is a global issue, but the impacts are also felt locally quite often. So if what is left as farms get bigger and as people leave the community is a small number of people, who may know the local community, but may not have sort of the background or the problem solving ability to kind of address some of the solutions, like those who have the increased levels maybe of education or just have more attachment to the community. If what's left is sort of hollowed out, then it kind of impacts small communities' ability to address problems that are faced. So many of the pedagogies that I look to foster both an appreciation for place and a sense of problem solving around local issues that are faced within local places. So whether that's looking at your local creek and the ways that the watershed system can be sustained locally, or whether that's, looking at seepage of chemicals off fields into water systems, or any number of environmental issues that might exist locally. I see the role of education to start problematizing those things at a younger age, so that people can be thinking about them and working towards solutions. And hopefully we can find ways to keep people interested in the local, valuing the local, and not leaving only to learn that they valued the local. So those are some of my thoughts about rurality and brain drain. I'm not sure if Alysha, you have anything to add, or Michelle.
Just say quickly that one of the things I really appreciate about Candy is her focus on rural as strength, and this idea that rural places are places of knowledge, like she just said. A lot of times rural places are kind of denigrated as like, oh, they're, looked down on, or there's stereotypes that people are poorly educated there, or it's kind of backwards or whatever. And Candy always advocates against those stereotypes. And I really appreciate that about her. And I think that also comes across in her chapter for sure, and maybe in the book as a thread, that rural places are places of knowledge and situated knowledge.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I know there's a lot of people here interested in art and activism and teaching for art in time of climate crisis, or the Anthropocene. And so, and the group that is running this is called Education for Sustainability and Global Futures. And so I'm thinking about maybe the role of art in futures thinking and futures building, but you might also take it in other directions. And so I'm just curious if you can talk, you've talked a little bit about it already, but talk a bit more about how you understand the purpose and role of art in the Anthropocene in education, and especially with an eye to the future.
So one of the last big research projects I worked with a group of about 37-ish high school youth in and around southwestern Manitoba, and we were so lucky to work with a variety of eco-artists who are exploring many of the topics we've already discussed this morning. And that work with the eco-artists culminated into an exhibition that at the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba that ran for a couple of months. And over 4,000 people came to see that exhibition. And you compare that number with how many folks might read a peer-reviewed article, for example. And so Brandon, I love our little city, but I think it's fair to say that we are it's a fairly conservative city, small city. And one of the things that walking through the exhibition with different community members that viewed the students' artwork around their thoughts and feelings and wonderings about the climate crisis and also the future, what the future holds for them, is the art was a way to hold the complexity. So people would stop at a painting or one of the sculptures made from reclaimed materials, and you could hear them out loud musing with the person they'd come to the gallery with around, how they were layering their own stories, their own questions, their own worries, their own thoughts on climate change to the artwork. And to me, it reminded me about sort of the democratic potential of art, right? That when you encounter an artwork, it is an invitation to you to bring your own story to the piece. And I think that is, we need more of that in education, to gather around an event, a topic, a piece of art that allows us to hold competing perspectives in the same place at the same time. So counter to our social media bubbles that are, controlled by algorithms. So I think there's emancipatory potential in art that doesn't exist in other ways of working with young people around this topic. And I saw that in all the conversations that I overheard and joined in to when students were viewing this, or when folks were viewing the students' artwork. So that's, one offering I have about the power of art to explore this kind of work. Michelle or Candy, did you want to?
Alysha, if you want to talk about, I went to that exhibition, of course, and you walk down this narrow hallway, and at the very end, you're greeted by this big chalkboard. And on the reverse of the chalkboard, she had people write messages. I wonder if you want to talk about those messages at all, Alysha. I found them incredibly powerful for imagining. So I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. As the students were really passionate about the idea that everyone who was a part of the project, including the researchers and the research assistants, needed to make art too. So if we were going to be democratic about this, we had to go all the way. And so, I included some of my photography work, and I also created this installation that Michelle's referring to. And so on the front, I had interview quotes from the students, and they were really jarring. And on the back of the chalkboard, and it took me a long time to track down an old school chalkboard, but we finally did it. And on the back, we invited people to leave a message to the graduating class of 2050. So trying to find pragmatic ways for inviting community members to think about education, not just as the grade 4 kids, who might be sitting in front of teachers in September, but thinking about the graduating class of 2050, 2060, 2070, right? So stretching our obligations, our ethical obligations to students out further into the future. And so those messages were really compelling. There were little ones who drew pictures of trees and hearts and sunflowers. There were older folks who made statements of apology. There were folks who said, "We're trying. We hope it works out," like those kinds of, they're kind of emotional. "We hope it works out, and we're giving it a go." So it was just a really moving, evolving piece of art in response to the voices of the kids. And so the artwork was not filtered by me as the researcher. The young people who participated created pieces and then invited interactions around them. So that's another thing that's powerful about arts-based research. It's less mediated by the researcher. Less of my fingers are in it, right? It's the participants have a chance to say what they want to say and invite an emotional response to their thinking in ways that are, less controlled by the researcher, to be sure. So.
I'll just add one more thing about throughout the book, there's a variety of arts-based methods too. I'm thinking about the chapter by Kathy Sanford, about the community. I'm sorry, I forget what it was called. It was a house that they had made into an installation, right? Or the EnviroDigiArt. That was in one of the chapters. So there was a variety of understandings of the arts in relation to dealing with the complex topics of the book. So the fact that thread was prevalent through speaks to its effectiveness, I think, in dealing with complicated and complex topics.
I just wanted to add one more piece here for our arts-based folks in the Zoom room, is that one of the things that I heard Bill McKibben say the other day was that, traditionally education is focused on siloed disciplines. We sort of modeled ourselves off of what he referred to as the hard sciences, but we are not living in that world anymore. I mean, that world has done some good. And so it's not that we don't want to have some of that Western knowledge supporting us as we work our way through mitigating some of the things that are coming our way. But we need other kinds of bodies of knowledge that are all about connections, inviting people to see the connections. And art can invite people to see connections from their own lives and lived experiences in ways that other disciplines like biology and physics may not be able to. And so I'm a big proponent of artwork because it invites shared storytelling in public spaces. And one of the things, Catherine Hayhoe reminds us about all the time is that the best thing we can do about confronting climate change is to talk about it with each other, particularly in educational spaces. And art gets you talking. It pokes you and says, what do you think about this? Right? And I think that's also a really beautiful way to engage with this difficult topic.
Just to continue talking about art is I think, powerful way to help youth to youth activism, but also a way students help students to focus on creativity, not helplessness, right? Several chapters discussed how to nurture confidence and hope-infused pedagogies in youth. So would you be able to talk about how can that be successful in classroom? So maybe like you talked about eco-paralysis, eco-anxiety, and how can teachers, maybe pre-service, in-service teachers, help not only recognize this distress in students, but also support them.
Michelle or Kenny, did you want me to have a go at this one first, or do you want to?
Go for it, Alysha.
This is your topic, Alysha.
One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently in the context of, doing the work on the book and then some other projects I'm working on is inviting teachers to think about their own defenses against the difficult knowledge of climate change. Because one of the things that kept coming up in the interview with the young people I worked with on that eco arts project I talked about earlier was they said, we don't really talk about it in class. Like, it's a unit in science, but then we don't talk about it. And we're so worried about it. And isn't it kind of weird? One of the participants said, isn't it so weird that like our life is going to change in really big ways, and yet the people who are teaching us aren't really talking about it? And I said, yeah, that is really weird. And so let's think about that. And so we talked, they had offered some things about why they think it's troublesome for teachers. Some talked about it would politicize the classroom, but most talked about that they cared for their teachers and worried that their teachers might think it might invite conflict between students if they were talking about it in classrooms. So in terms of how we might support teachers and kids to have difficult conversations around this topic, I do think that we need to, first of all, broaden our understanding of mental health and well-being. And so there's one branch of that for me that connects well-being to the flourishing of life and is more of a collective understanding. So it's often systems that make people unwell. But I don't know about in the States, but certainly in Canada, we talk about mental health in a very medicalized model, right? And so if a kid is experiencing what might be unfortunately labeled eco-anxiety in school, we might send them to the guidance counselor, when really eco-anxiety and eco-grief are pretty healthy responses to the things that kids are facing and we're facing as adults too. And so it's normalizing for me a collective approach to mental health and well-being, linking that to the life and healing of the planet. And then also working with teachers so they feel comfortable having these conversations. And we talk to them about, how people defend against difficult knowledge, how to invite people to come closer. What pedagogies can you use to invite people to come closer as opposed to things that might push them away? So all sorts of those types of things. I think it's a burgeoning field, climate psychology, but boy, do we have a lot of work to do in that area in the field of public education. So those are just a couple of slivers, of things we might think about starting on.
Can I add one small piece that Candy and I noticed when we were going through the artwork from those kindergarten and grade 1 kids, and thinking back to that thing I said earlier around the children's voices having wisdom that we need to remember as adults. And we noticed that in those pieces of art, the children knew where their places are, where they feel good, right? So we saw, like the cover, the person up in the tree, or we saw lots of pictures of people with their pets or spending time with their dog or their cat, or we saw kind of favorite places that people had or places in nature. And I think the children do know at those young ages. And I think we do well to remember and to be able to create those spaces and connections to have more importance and more weight in the things that we do in the classroom.
And a very concrete way to do that is, we know there's lots of work coming out right now around the connections to well-being and spending time outside. And I think education as a whole needs to rewild itself in remarkable ways. And that means learning outside. So not that we just take our English class outside to read under a tree. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that the land that surrounds the school is the curriculum. And that's if we thought about the land and the place as curriculum, it would change everything. It would bring things into a transdisciplinary space. It would link learning to life as opposed to social mobility, which we often tell kids, you got to learn this stuff so you get a job and you can buy the house and all those kinds of things, participate in a very capitalist orientation to living. But if we rewilded education in all sorts of ways, I think we would get closer to solving some of our troubles, and also we could learn in ways that are amazing and imaginative and deeply connected to caring for others, not just other humans, but other beings on the planet too.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alysha. I wish we could have like a whole hour to talk about how to do that in online learning too. There's 2 different universities here running masters in, like I mentioned at the beginning, masters in sustainability education. And so how do we draw, how do we rewild online learning? How do we help those students connect with the places around them, surrounding or during their Zooms and Canvas platforms or whatever else they're using? I would love to have that conversation, just to build on what you've been saying. I have lots more questions recorded, but I want to just give a moment here to see if there's anyone in the who's attending, if anyone here has any questions for the editors before I launch into my endless stream of questions. No? All right. You're thinking, and please feel free to type it out, and I'm sure you'll still have time after another one of the questions that I have, which is, this one's from Michelle, and I know you've already talked a little bit about refugees earlier, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot as well. And it's a group of students who in many ways is, categorically excluded from conversations about climate education. There's no way of defining a climate refugee really legally. And, environmentally displaced people, whether across borders or within borders, in BC with fires burning entire communities, where do those people go, and what does their education look like? And then climate refugees as an issue, seems to be fueling some right-wing backlash against climate action and climate education. So we have all these discourses of overpopulation and nationalism and ecofascism that is potentially going to infuse our education spaces, depending on our local politics or national politics. And so you, or of course others, can you talk a little bit about how does education respond? What is our role in relation to the issue of climate refugees?
Well, I don't know that I have answers, but I could share some thoughts around the topic, and Alysha and Candy, feel free to jump in too. So I'm not a legal scholar, but it's my understanding that, like you said, currently under the UN protections, when you become a refugee, there are certain categories that you are protected under. So are you fleeing war? Are you fleeing persecution, etc.? Climate change is not one of the protected categories currently. And yet I think the stat that I said at the beginning was from the World Bank, but by year 2050, it's expected to be 1 in 50 people who will be displaced. And that's not necessarily crossing an international border, but 1 in 50 people will have to leave their home because of climate change or because of the climate crisis. And that's a huge, overwhelming kind of number. And so I think the things that we're talking about in the book around some of the conversations you've already heard in this meeting, how can we help students grapple with this idea that it's not just something happening over there and they can ignore that? How can we help people start to connect the stories that they hear in the news or the stories that isn't even that far away, right? It might be their own province. That way of distancing ourselves from difficult knowledge is still a really common response, right? Like, that's not me, that's not my family. I can just kind of push it away. But to start to connect those stories with our stories, and I think when we see each other in those stories, it helps us understand and think through the connections between, right? So I think it's incredibly important to guide students through that difficult knowledge rather than here's the piece of information and then let's move on quick so we don't have to have these hard conversations. We need to provide spaces for people to grieve or spaces for people to work through the emotions. And we need to be able to teach people how to care for one another. So refugees isn't something that's happening way over there. Refugees are in your classroom. Refugees are in your community. How can we care for one another in ways that deeply honor the person that's there, not in a top-down kind of way, but in a human-to-human kind of way, that your story and my story can be deeply interconnected. And it's not that I'm better than you and I'm helping you and it's only one direction. It's that we're the same. And how can we together build something better for our community or for our planet? And I think students are so encouraged to think in these individualistic categories and competitive ways of being in the classroom still. And we need to start thinking more holistically around how can we work together and intentionally build those connections so that we're thinking about things like cooperation for the future rather than, this kind of top down, I sent a shoebox overseas for Christmas. And so I did my good task for the week, right? Instead, it needs to be something much more ongoing and connected and relational. So those are my thoughts around the topic, but others might also be able to chime in.
Thanks, Michelle. I appreciate it. It's tough, tough realities, but important for us to think about, how we respond with our students, but also in the systems level, to accommodate those students who will be moving around. So thank you for that. And I think we maybe have time for one more quick question, and then we'll wrap up. Our last book talk last week was on a book about climate denial with Mark Baildon and James D'Amico. And so they were talking in the context of literacy and social studies classrooms. And your book also addresses disavowal of the climate crisis in schools, and you mentioned that a little bit at the beginning, and provide some pretty concrete inroads for teachers. And so maybe you can share a little bit about how you understand the problem of climate denial in schools and how educators can address this.
I think it goes back to something that Michelle said earlier around listening closely to people's stories. So, for example, and Renee Lertzman has done some great work on apathy, like really unpacking what apathy means. So because of her work and some of the work that's been done in motivational interviewing, I've learned that apathy doesn't necessarily mean I don't care about this. It means that there are good reasons to change and good reasons not to change. And some people are hovering in that messy, that liminal space of deciding to change or not to change. And so it's thinking about how do we invite conversations with young people and their families that don't make people feel guilty or ashamed, and keeping them in that messy middle with you, like keeping them coming closer, so you can work through some of these specific examples. And one of the ways to do that is to find out what you love that's common. Because I think with most folks in the world, you can find that space of find what you love that's common. And that's a great, I think, a pedagogical move in a learning encounter. So, that's one. It might sound small, but it can change everything when you can, connect and weave different stories together. So that's one idea of how to deal with tricky knowledge.
Yeah, thanks, Alysha. And so important in this time where it feels like the chasm between us, is so deep, whether left or right, whatever that chasm is. And so finding those ways of bridge building and understanding each other is so important. So thank you. I feel like that's a good note to end on, perhaps a hopeful note to end on. I'm aware of time and that people need to leave for other meetings. And so I really want to thank you for coming. I hope I'll get to see Michelle at least at Congress, and the rest of you. Thank you to all three of you for taking the time to come today, and for our audience members listening so attentively, and Dilraba for co-hosting. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. We'll stay in touch online. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.